Hey, welcome back to Compounding Quietly. Most dividend investors are tracking the wrong number. It's not the yield, and it's not the payout. You watch the dividend land in your account, and it feels like proof you're doing this right. But that feeling and your actual return can tell. Two completely different stories. So what is the number that actually decides whether this strategy is working? Let's actually look at this clearly. Right now, a lot of dividend investors are quietly anxious. Even when the dividend checks keep arriving on schedule, the market drops, headlines turn negative, and the deposit still lands in the account like nothing happened. So why does it still feel uncertain? Because most investors were trained to watch one number, the income, and ignore the number sitting right next to it, the price. Every time a position falls 10% while still paying its dividend, a quiet question shows up. Is this still working, or am I just collecting income on something that's losing value underneath me? That question keeps repeating. And it isn't because the strategy is broken. It repeats because of how the information gets presented. Brokerage apps show you a dividend deposit in green. They show you a falling share price in red on the same screen on the same day. Two signals, sent at the same time, pointing in opposite directions. Most investors resolve that conflict by trusting the green number because it feels like income. And income feels safe and certain. The red number feels like risk, so it gets dismissed as noise, or temporary, or irrelevant to the plan. But here's the criteria that actually matters. And it has nothing to do with which number feels more comfortable in the moment. Total return is the combination of what a position pays you and what that position is worth, not one or the other. Both, together, measured over the time you actually hold it. If you only watch the dividend, you are measuring half of the picture and calling it the whole thing. That's not optimism. That's an incomplete read of your own results. The real criteria isn't, is the dividend still arriving? The real criteria is the combination of income and value moving in the direction this position needs it to move? Here's the judgment criteria that should sit underneath every total return decision you make. You are not investing for a number that shows up quarterly. You're investing for the compounding of two separate engines, running at the same time, whether you're watching them or not. The first engine is price what the market is currently willing to pay for the underlying business, or the basket of businesses inside the fund. The second engine is the dividend, and, more specifically, what happens to that dividend once it gets reinvested instead of spent. Total return is what you get when both engines are allowed to run for years. It is not what either engine looks like individually after one rough quarter. Picture two investors holding the exact same dividend growth position for 10 years. The first investor checks the share price every week, sometimes every day. When the price drops, she feels behind, even though her dividend has kept growing on schedule the entire time. When the price rises, she feels validated, even if her underlying yield on cost barely moved that year. Her sense of progress is being driven entirely by whichever engine she happens to be looking at that day. That's an exhausting way to evaluate a long-term position, and it produces a distorted read of how things are actually going. The second investor reinvests every dividend automatically and checks in twice a year at most. He isn't ignoring the price. He simply isn't using it as the only signal that matters. Over 10 years, both investors may end up holding the exact same number of shares with the same total return, but only one of them experienced 10 years of unnecessary stress because only one of them was measuring the wrong thing in the short term. The position didn't change, the lens did. This is where the original question comes back. What does total return actually mean for a dividend investor? It means the dividend is not the finish line. It's one half of an engine. The other half is what the market is willing to pay for that income stream over time, and whether reinvestment is doing compounding work in the background while you're not looking. There's a second piece of this that most dividend investors skip entirely, and it's yield on cost. Starting yield tells you what a position pays relative to today's price. Yield on cost tells you what that same position pays relative to what you originally paid for it years ago. Consider an investor who bought a dividend growth position at a 3% starting yield. If the underlying dividend grows for 10 straight years, her yield on cost could quietly climb well past 6 or 7%, even though the position's current quoted yield to a new buyer looks unremarkable. A new investor scanning the same position today sees an average yield and moves on, unimpressed. The investor who already owns it is looking at a completely different number, built from years of growth she already locked in. That's the part total return captures, and starting yield never will. Starting yield is a snapshot. Yield on cost is a trend line, and total return is what that trend line actually adds up to. A dividend growing at 6% a year can still produce a disappointing total return if the price of admission keeps getting deflated by the market for years at a time. And a position with a modest, unremarkable yield can produce a strong total return if the underlying business keeps growing, and the market eventually reflects that. The dividend tells you about cash flow. Total return tells you whether the decision itself was actually a good one. Those two things are related, but they are not the same question. And conflating them is where a lot of quiet, low-grade frustration comes from. The direction of judgment here is simple. Even if it isn't the most comfortable habit to build, stop grading a position by the size of the dividend deposit alone. Start asking what the combined number looks like over a holding period measured in years, not in quarters and not in headlines. None of this means price stops mattering, or that you should ignore it completely. It means price stops being the only thing you check when you're deciding whether a position is doing its job. The market will keep sending you two signals at once, one in income, one in price, and most days they won't agree with each other. You don't need to resolve that tension every single week. You need one number that accounts for both, measured over a period long enough for compounding to actually show up and do its work. That number is total return. The dividend was never the whole story. It was always just one half of it. Knowing that doesn't make the next price drop feel comfortable, and it isn't supposed to. It just means you'll be reacting to the right number instead of the loudest one on the screen that day. That's the only real adjustment. This change is not your strategy, just what you're actually measuring when you check in. The criteria doesn't change because the price moved. That's the whole point. Compounding quietly. Slow, steady wealth building. If this helped, subscribe and leave a like. Everything here is for informational purposes only. All final decisions and responsibilities remain with you. Thanks for spending time with Compounding Quietly today.